Morning. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending today. Clearly, my name's Keith Brown. I lead the national research into financial fraud and scamming for the Chartered Trading Standards Institute and the National Scams team, and have been doing for a number of years now. So I'm going to bring together some thoughts and reflections on fraud and scams for you today, and very happy to take questions and whatever later on. So off we go. Thank you, Matthew. Next slide. So just really to start off with our thoughts really around safeguarding, I'd just like to suggest that in the recent past, most of our actions have been around physical abuse and assault, but a realization that financial fraud and scamming is increasingly an issue for organisations, and now there is a statutory duty for local authorities to try and protect citizens from the financial fraud as part of a CARE Act. Next slide, Matthew. But just a reminder really that fraud and scams have been around for a long time. They haven't just arrived in the last year or two or three or four. But of real note is that the National Scams Team, Trading Standards Scams Team, wasn't actually created until 2012. And their initial and early work was to remind us all and to recognise that scammers or fraudsters were indeed criminals, and often indeed serious and organised crime. But I'd like to suggest that just like the awareness of child abuse grew in the 1970s and 80s, there's now a realisation that significant scams are from relatives and friends and from other people in a position of trust, i.e. a paid carer. And that's something I'd like to come back to in a couple of minutes' time. Thank you, Matthew. So what do we know about scamming and fraud? Well, of course, we can all be potential victims of fraud and scams, and certainly, interestingly, in the last few weeks, I don't know about you, but I've been getting quite a lot of phone calls from people claiming to be my internet provider, and my internet's about to be switched off because of some illegal use on it or something, unless I prepare to pay some sum of money or to click onto their site. And of course, during lockdown, internet's become rather important for us all, and so they know how to press the buttons, don't they? So the fraudsters are after us all, but what we do specifically know is that it's the lonely, and in particular the lonely elderly in cognitive decline, who are most at risk. These are, to put it bluntly, the best victims for criminals. They are people that they can repeat and repeat and repeat fraud to. Often some of these people don't even recognise they've been defrauded. And of course, if we do recognise there's been a fraud, they're often reluctant to go to court and sometimes find it difficulty to make credible witnesses in court. We also recognise that the scale of scams is immense. It's estimated to be something in the order of £5 to £10 billion a year, not million, but billions. In other words, it's huge. Criminals are moving away from domestic burglary. Well, of course, we're all at home all the time, aren't we, at the moment with lockdown? And therefore, there's not a lot of point in trying to do domestic burglary. Our cars have tracker alarms on them and are much more difficult to steal. And frankly, criminals do what they call risk and reward ratios. They look at what the risk and reward potential is from fraud, and the rewards are massive, and frankly, the risks are quite small. Very few of them get caught and successfully prosecuted, and even if they are, the tariff for the crime is usually much less than for other crimes. But we also know that the impact of being scammed is much more than just simply the loss of money. There's a huge impact on psychological well-being and confidence. Plus, I'd also like to remind us all the impact on the wider family. So my mother passed away a few years ago, but before that, she was in the early stages of dementia, and she was scammed a number of times. And I still personally bear some of the scars as her eldest son, a professor of social work, an expert in this field, struggling to protect my own mother. So it's not just the victims, it's the wider family and indeed the wider community. And why do I say the wider community? Well, I'd just like you to pause for a moment and consider what would happen in your local area if, let's say, 10, 20, 30 or 40 elderly people were scammed of their life savings in the next month. And because of their impact on their well-being and their confidence, they all felt unable to continue to live in their homes and wanted to move into residential care. Of course, if they've lost all their income and all their money, who would pick up the cost of that residential care? It would be the local authority. So how many residents in your local authority need to be scammed next month, lose all their funding or their income, end up in care for your local authority to be on the verge of bankruptcy? And I'd like to suggest it's not many. Thank you, Matthew. So I mentioned the scamming, a journey of discovery. Well, just a reminder, really, it was 1957 when an American radiographer called Finkelhor, looking at some x-rays of children, detected previously undiagnosed fractures and made the first suggestion hypothesis that some of these were non-accidental injuries. And nearly 20 years ago in Britain, we were still referring to this as non-accidental injury, an NAI. And around 1979-80, we started to use the term child abuse, but it was primarily for physical child abuse. And by the mid-80s, we started to talk about child sexual abuse, and in the late 80s, 90s, we started to also consider things like child emotional and psychological abuse. But in those early days, it was always assumed that the abuser was some unknown person, picture in our minds that person wearing a dirty old raincoat at the bottom of the road who was assaulting our children. But a growing realization now we have is that most abusers are actually known to the victim and are often even family and friends or from a position of trust. And I think we're at that stage now with financial fraud and scams, a realization that although clearly there's huge amounts of serious and organized crime involved in fraud, what we don't understand very much is the amount of fraud going on from within families and friends. And indeed, I'm in the process of writing an all-party parliamentary report at the moment, coming out in Easter, just to look and explore this area. There is no known research that I know of in this field at all, and I'm just suggesting it's an area that we really do need to consider far more carefully. What we don't know is whether, of course, family and friends are defrauding their relatives in what I would call a vain attempt to try and avoid care home fees or inheritance tax costs. Often you hear the phrase, I'm going to inherit it anyway, therefore I'm going to have some of it now. But what I do know, for example, is that an LD 94-year-old lady who won the £1 million premium bond earlier this year, within 2 or 3 weeks, her two 60-year-old sons, they're in their 60s, had written checks themselves in the order of £730,000 without her knowledge or understanding or authority. So, the scale of this can be absolutely massive. Next slide. I also, though, just want to take a pause and to remind us that there's clear evidence of what I call legal companies targeting and repeat selling to vulnerable individuals. Questions often, are these people making an unwise decision, or is there a cognitive impairment issue? What I mean by this is, clearly there are lots of people who are on sales targets. And it's also clear that some of these organisations and companies, they have their own, what criminals call suckers list. It's a terrible term, suckers list, but it's what criminals use. Maybe we could call it a victims list or a hit list. And companies will phone up these people on a Friday at the end of the week or at the end of the month to try and hit their sales targets. My mother was sold £3,500 worth of vitamin supplements in the space of 10 days by one company. There was enough vitamin D sold to her to probably kill most of the residents on her road. So it is legal companies acting in what I call an illegal way or an immoral way, but it can also be a charity or a fundraiser who might be phoning every week for a donation. And of course, people in cognitive decline will not even realise that they've already given a donation the week before or the week before or the week before, or in my mother's case, that she's bought the vitamins last week and the week before, and she doesn't need that volume of vitamin supplements. I mean, it literally was 16 bin bags full that I ended up bringing out of her house once. So this, my point here is that scamming is not just driven by criminals, but also by legitimate organisations, sometimes acting in an illegal and inappropriate way. Next slide. I also want to just raise this thought, really. Is it a scam to charge people different rates for the same service and product simply on the basis that you can get away with it due to their age, their gender, their cognitive ability, or their relative social isolation? Is buyer beware always the right way? In other words, if I charge you £10 for a service or a product, but charge your neighbour £50 for that same service or product, but maybe your mother £100 for that same service and product, simply because I think, well, she's older, her cognitive ability is not so strong, she's got nobody living with her to sense check what's going on, and she agrees the price. Is that a reasonable deal? And of course, this is where many of the doorstep traders get away with their fraud and their scams. You need a roof tile fixing, you need your fence panel repairing, and people don't fully understand what a going rate for that repair is, and suddenly it's thousands of pounds for a roof tile, or £2,000 to have some fence panels replaced, or whatever it is. Next slide. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, who's a forensic criminologist specialising in the use of language, and I wrote this guide earlier this year in the early lockdown, partly because we were a little bit bored in lockdown number 1, but also we wanted to do some work on what we called the power of persuasive language. Be under no illusion, there is so much money to be made by fraudsters and scammers and criminals. They have the very best training. They have so much resource that they can invest on thinking about how to use appropriate language to win you over. We in the defence world, the world of police, social services, adult safeguarding, just have a fraction of the resource that criminals have. And so they are hiring the very best psychologists and marketers to consider how best to attack us. It's no longer a time when we can spot a fraud simply because it's something that's badly spelt or badly presented or just doesn't look right. You know, they can use spell checkers as well, and they can afford to employ the very best copywriters and the very best trainers. So moving on. So for me, the reason why I wanted to write this document is to make the point that it's not about people being gullible or vulnerable. Often it was people saying, well, why were they so stupid? What we're ignoring in this situation is the reality that scammers are highly skilled manipulators of language, and that they can use techniques designed to make people feel at ease and to allay any cause for concern. Next slide. This is a genuine case that the name's been changed. She wasn't called Joan, but I've called her Joan for this situation. And this Joan was an elderly lady in her 80s. She was married, had been married for 50 years. Her husband always managed the family finances, but had previously had a stroke. So Joan had taken over managing the family finances. And she was scammed a significant sum of money, in excess of £100,000, by criminals pretending to be her bank, claiming that her account had been intercepted and fraudulently managed, and persuaded her to move the money out of her bank account into a safe, in inverted commas, bank account, whereupon the money was stolen. And this money was removed from her account in the space of a week. And this is what Joan described. This is how Joan described herself. We both realised that we'd been victims of mind control. We were not making independent decisions at all during the time. When I was groomed to act deceptively with those official bank fraud staff members, it felt as though I'd been robbed of my integrity. I do not believe that I have knowingly and willfully deceived anyone in my life, and so it felt as though my very character had been ripped apart. There were sleepless nights and weight loss. I was staggered to find I'd lost over half a stone in weight when the scam finally surfaced. Normal lifestyle was at a standstill. All this and more was experienced during that time. I truly felt as though somebody had raped me. When finally the communication was made with genuine bank staff, the feeling was one of such overwhelming tiredness that we could hardly tell them what had been going on. Brain dead would just about sum up how we both felt. And notice how the type of language that Joan used to describe herself. She herself, without any prompting, described herself as somebody who'd been groomed, robbed of her integrity, somebody who she felt she'd been raped, and she was brain dead. The impact was massive. Next slide. Postmail. I don't know if you're aware, but if you get over 10 letters or roughly 10 letters a day to your house, your average postie is not allowed to deliver them, and the Royal Mail will set up a specialist service to deliver your post. I went to visit a gentleman, and in his back garden was 3 garden sheds, and these garden sheds were full of mail, full of scam mail, full of unwanted prizes, unwanted products he'd bought. And yet, in his dining room was a clear table with a pen, and it was all set up as a little study. And I asked him why he had so much scam mail and what was going on, and did he realise he was being targeted by fraudsters? And his response completely shook me to the core. He basically said that in his view, he had no reason to exist and no reason to get out of bed every morning other than to wait for the postie and for the post to arrive and to go through the post and respond to scam mail. He had no interaction with the outside world. He had no communication or contact with anybody. And the only contact he had was criminals and scam mail. And that was his raison d'etre for existing. And the point I'd like to make here is that I don't believe we have any chance of stopping fraud and scams until we fundamentally, as society, tackle loneliness. Loneliness with young people as well as old people. Loneliness and isolation, because you can be lonely or isolated even in a crowd. And another example of this is last year we were undertaking the evaluation of the National Trading Standards research project using call blocking technology. The Department for Culture, Media and Sport had invested quite a significant sum of money into providing call blocking technology to victims of telephone fraud. They were all lonely, isolated people who had previously been defrauded. And the call blocking technology works by putting basically a small machine or a gadget between the wall socket in your house and your telephone, and it intercepts any unknown numbers, and particularly international call numbers. The problem with this research was that many of the victims who had been previously receiving 20, 30, 40, 50 phone calls a week from criminals suddenly found they received no phone calls. And they were so lonely that, frankly, they disconnected the call blocking technology, ruined our research evaluation, because they would rather have criminals phone them than be in isolation with no call at all. And this wasn't 1 or 2 people that disconnected the call blocking technology. This was significant numbers. So I come back to, we really do need to tackle loneliness and isolation in society. Next slide. This slide really is just a reminder to us all. Trading Standards are the lead organisation that do enforcement procedures and tackle criminals, fraud, scams. But the investment in our country in trading standards has roughly halved in the last decade. That's a staggering thought, isn't it? At a time when we know there's more and more fraud and more scams going on, we've gone from 213 million to 124 million pounds invested in trading standards in the UK. And remember, trading standards don't just have to look out for fraud. They've got to make sure a pint of beer is a pint of beer, a litre of petrol is a litre of petrol, a 400-gram loaf of bread weighs 400 grams, etc. Do with livestock, do with all sorts of other issues. fraudulent goods, counterfeit goods, all these things. And yet, as a country, we're only spending £124 million on trading standards. Move on, please. I also want to remind us about a new thing we've just labelled it recently, in the last year or so, clairvoyant scamming, and I've just called it the new kid on the block, just for a bit of fun, really, but it's not funny. This is basically to do with obituary columns. Imagine Mr. and Mrs. Smith have been married for 50 years, and Mr. Smith passes away. Mrs. Smith goes along to the local newspaper or a family and puts in the obituary column in your local newspaper that Mr. Smith has recently passed away, wife of, da-da-da, married for 50 years, loving father of, grandfather of, whatever. Criminals are looking through the digital newspapers, and all of our local newspapers are now available online, looking at the obituary columns and following up on these people who are bereaved, making contact with them and claiming to be clairvoyants. If you give me a small sum of money, I will make a contact with your recently deceased loved one. Using that persuasive language, they build a relationship, start taking money from these victims. Of course, after a while, often the victim realizes that there isn't real contract being made with the dead, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe we can communicate with the dead. But then they turn around and say, if you don't continue to fund me, because I'm a clairvoyant, I will put an evil curse on you and you will become seriously ill or unwell yourself. The fear and the nightmare that these people are able to put onto members of your community and my community is immense. So I just put the slide there to remind us all, don't use obituary columns in local or national newspapers. Criminals actively seek this sort of data to target these people in their moment of greatest vulnerability. Next slide. Clearly, with NHS contact tracing, there's been a rise of people in the fraud world pretending to be from NHS trace and test or contact tracing, asking for money. It's always a fraud. I just put that there to remind us, really. Also to remind us, though, that the telephone numbers that we get on our mobiles aren't necessarily the right mobiles numbers. And what I mean by that is you and I can buy a piece of technology so that if I know the name of your bank, if I know the name of your doctor, if I know the name and telephone number of anyone that's known to you, I can use that number and pretend to be that person. Just because a number comes up on your phone that you recognize does not mean it is from that number. It is very easy to mask and to mimic any telephone number. Official website addresses, IP addresses cannot be faked, but you can still set up a website that looks the same, and you have to dig quite deeply to actually spot a genuine or a fraud website. So just really some advice about that. Always consider ringing back on a different phone to a different number if an organisation phones you. If someone from a bank tries to phone you, well, and they ask for money, well, that's always a fraud because a bank would never do that. But ring on another phone to another number to confirm that. Next slide, please. I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about a little bit more about dementia and the Mental Capacity Act. This gentleman is PC Paul Briggs. He was killed, knocked off a motorbike on the way to work. He wasn't a police motorcyclist. He was, official one. He was just going to work in the morning. Unfortunately, was knocked off his bike in 2015-16. This is his wife and his young child. Paul ended up in what's called a minimally conscious state, kept alive on a life support machine. His wife wanted the life support machine to be switched off, and she assumed because they were married and in her mind she was the next of kin, she thought that she would have the right to say to the hospital, please switch off the life support machine. It was at this point that she realised, and she was made to understand, that the term next of kin does not exist in law in this country. You are not the next of kin to your husband or wife. You're not even the next of kin in legal terms to your older child over 18. She campaigned for nearly a year to have life support switched off and went through the Court of Protection. And in December 2016, she was granted permission for life support to be switched off. But this was immediately challenged by the official solicitor because we don't allow euthanasia in this country. On that day, I spent probably 5 or 7 BBC radio programmes, and most people were asking me, why is it that could she not, as the next of kin, have the right to have life support switched off? And I kept having to explain to people it was to do with the issues around next of kin. Now, the Mental Capacity Act produces something called lasting powers of attorney. Lasting powers of attorney for health and welfare are the process by which you can ask and you can arrange for somebody to act on your behalf if you lose capacity. It often is through things like dementia, but it could be a brain injury like a stroke, or in this case, a motorbike crash. If you just go to the next slide, please. It's what I call advanced care planning. And so before I look specifically at the bits of legislation, I want to ask us as individuals in this webinar today. I guess you're on this webinar because you have an interest, professional interest, a personal interest in fraud, in scams and these sorts of things. And I just want to ask us all and challenge us all, what are you doing to better protect yourselves and your own loved ones? Have you personally had conversations with your own loved ones about your own mortality? Have you been able to speak about what you would want to have happen to your money if a tragic event happened to you? And have you talked about your own end-of-life desires? Advanced care planning, as I call it, for adults, not just for the elderly. Next slide. I've produced a series of guidelines around the Mental Capacity Act, including these two. The one on the right is the kind of introductory leaflet. The one on the left is one that looks at advanced care planning. They are available on that website at the bottom there, ncpqsw.com. They're also on the NHS Futures platform. And these are basically little small guidelines on areas around capacity, consent for treatment and these sorts of things. Do feel free to have a look at them. Next slide. Back to PC Paul Briggs. I was at the Department of Health and the Ministry of Justice a few years ago discussing the Paul Briggs situation, the Paul Briggs case, and basically making a plea that we needed to make better guidance available on the importance of lasting powers of attorney, particularly health and welfare ones, so that people who end up on life support don't end up on life support for a significant long period of time with no legal framework for people to make decisions about how to make decisions about whether the life support should be switched off or not. At the time, everybody agreed that it would be a good idea to write the guidance, but everyone was too busy dealing with Brexit in the government departments. So in a fit of pique, I ended up writing for the National Mental Capacity Forum the guidance on the right, next of kin understanding decision-making authorities, badged up by the OPG and others. And this is just a simple 4-page leaflet looking at the importance of lasting powers of attorney. And then on the left, following another case, I also wrote some guidance on what's called advanced decisions to refuse treatment. So you might want to have a situation that says, if I have a heart attack, don't resuscitate me. Or if I'm in a situation, I don't want these forms of resuscitation to exist, I would rather just pass away. And these are legal documents and have to be adhered to by anyone caring for you. So again, these are all available for you to look at and download for free. I think sometimes, though, it's useful to have hard copies, and I'm very happy to send. I think I've already sent a few copies up to you folks in Hull, but I'm happy to send some more. Simply as an icebreaker, I knew a High Court judge that wanted to take my leaflet on next of kin and fraud, and she put it on the seat of her car when she picked her mother up from the railway station. And when her mother sat on the seat and said, "Oh, what's this?" it was kind of the icebreaker into that complex discussion with her mother about her own end of life situation and her own finances. I don't know about you, but if I'd have spoken to my mother about her money and her financial affairs, she'd have been very quick as a northern lady to tell me to get knotted. It was her money and she'd do with it what she wanted. Next slide. I've also written a new textbook called Demystify Mental Capacity. This explains all the issues around capacity and consent for treatment, informed consent. If you didn't want to read the whole book, just read those leaflets I mentioned earlier, or at least read the concluding chapter of this text. It's only about 2,500 words. It will just guide you through those sorts of areas. Next slide. We also need to be aware that, of course, criminals are increasingly moving online as we move online. Banks are closing their branches in the rural areas, and so therefore increasingly we have to use internet banking. Many of us at the moment are doing most of our shopping via the internet. And of course, we've got, now it's not about necessarily older people not being very good at the internet. Many older people are fantastic on the internet, but I think particularly vulnerable are people that are not used to using the internet, that are now using the internet for the first time. They're kind of late adopters to internet. They are particularly vulnerable to criminals using the internet, and more criminals are going online. Frankly, it's cheaper for them than using post or telephone calls. Moving on. We're almost finished, and I'll take questions in a moment. I just thought for a bit of fun we would close with this. This is a genuine radio conversation that was overheard by a radio hack cam in October 1995 between a US naval ship and the Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland. Next slide. The Americans were heard to call out, "Please divert your course 15 degrees north to avoid a collision." Next. And the Canadians responded with, "Recommend you divert your course 15 degrees south to avoid a collision." You kind of know where this is going, don't you? Next. So the Americans were heard to say, "This is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course." Next. And the Canadians said, "No, I say again, divert your course." Next. So the Americans came up with, "This is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln. This is a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, the second largest ship in the US Atlantic Fleet. We're accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. And I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that's 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of the ship." Next. The Canadians' response was, "We're a lighthouse, your call." This wasn't just any old rock. This was a rock with a big lighthouse on it, with a big siren saying, "Do not come here." This was a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier with radar technology, GPS technology, qualified navigators, sailing towards this rock, demanding that the rock moved, that the rock shifted. In my slightly more lucid moments at the moment, I have this image of a certain President Donald Trump as the captain of this ship, but we won't go any further down that line. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in my view, in the future, we're going to look back at today and realize that scamming and fraud is probably the greatest form of crime, disruption, pain, hurt to vulnerable people in our society of anything at the moment at all. And we'll look back and we'll think, how on earth did we head towards that rock for so long without doing nearly enough about it? I've already presented the information about how much spend there is in our society on trading standards. It's great to be here with you today, working with police forces, adult safeguarding groups and others to try and raise this profile. But boy, oh boy, we need to raise it higher and we need to raise it further. And in particular, in my view, in my talk earlier on with you today, I think we really need to consider far more the amount of fraud that's going on within families. Next slide. So in summary, the cost of fraud and scams is huge in terms of cash, but it's also about that loss of confidence and that loss of dignity. There's also the cost to society. What additional cost is there to society if citizens are scammed of their life savings and the state picks up the costs? I described that earlier. There's also a cost to the carers and the relatives and the victims, particularly of those who have a cognitive impairment and are scammed. And I mentioned to you that that was exactly my situation. And it's one of the reasons why I'm still very keen and so keen to be involved and to do these sorts of seminars with you today. That sense of, well, I wasn't quite able to fully protect my mother all the time, and I'm still determined to try and do something about it now. And finally, though, we do need to have a better understanding of the scale and the impact of intrafamiliar abuse. So that's the end of my presentation.